Welcome aboard.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior healthcare reporter, Tina Reed.
Good morning, everyone. It is so exciting to be here today for our event where we are going to discuss the Prognosis for America's Pain Management. I help co-write the Axios Vitals newsletter where we cover the biggest healthcare stories of the day. So be sure to sign up if you haven't already subscribed by heading to the Axios website. We are here today in Miami to discuss what's next for the state of pain management and what are some of the common misconceptions surrounding the state of chronic pain care. We will cover the advocacy perspective, how providers today are thinking about the challenges in today's treatment landscape, and what to do about it. Our first guest is the co-chair of the NFL Joint Management Committee, Dr. Kevin Hill. Dr. Hill, welcome to Axios. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's great to be here.
Very excited to chat with you, especially because the NFL has done something that no other professional sports league has yet done, which is create a prescription drug monitoring database. So can you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Sure. So in 2019, the NFL started with the NFLPA, the Pain Management Committee that I co-chair with Jeff Ling, who's a neurologist at Hopkins. And so we've been a part of a lot of things involving the education of the team medical staffs and the players. And one of the things that we've done, we partnered with some data folks who work with the NFL to create a prescription drug monitoring program. And what the PDMP does is that we track all of the prescriptions that players receive. And so we've actually described this and published the process, and we've just recently published some early data from the PDMP from the 2021 and 2022 seasons. And the results were actually pretty surprising, I would say. And so we looked at all the prescriptions, and again, thinking about what players receive for pain management, and about 85% of those prescriptions were for NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, for example. And only 3% of the prescriptions were for opioids, right? So we're in the midst of an opioid epidemic, for sure. 80,000 opioid-related deaths in 2023. Fentanyl, everyone's heard about fentanyl, 50 times more potent than heroin. So we wanted to, track what the players are receiving with the hopes that, we're going to mitigate the risks of some of these medications, including opioids. And so we were pleased to see that only 3% of the prescriptions were for opioids, and only about 10% of the players actually received an opioid prescription during those two seasons. So we're happy with those results.
How does that compare to the general population?
Great question. So if you look at sort of an age-matched control group in the general population, let's say males 25 to 34, that's generally how they're split up, about 15% of that group in any 1 year receives an opioid prescription. So as much as it may be surprising to some people, players in the NFL receive fewer opioid prescriptions than their age-matched controls do.
That's really interesting. And I did see, though, there's a study of retired NFL players misusing opioid pain medications at a rate of more than 4 times the general population. And so I guess, are you saying, has there been a change over time, or what do you think is happening there?
Absolutely. So again, we take these data very seriously, and so that study that you're talking about, I think, was one of the reasons that the NFL and the NFLPA decided to create the committee that I co-chair. And so we've really been working hard in recent years to try to bring those numbers down and to reduce the risk, right? We want to improve the pain management of these players, right? It's a high-risk collision sport where there are a lot of injuries, frankly. They're putting their bodies on the line every day, their lives on the line. And so we want to have the best pain management tools for that group. And so we saw, that data there, and we were tasked with trying to think about how we can bring those numbers down to make a game more safe if that's possible. And so again, the PDMP, part of that, in addition to tracking the data, there's feedback allowed, right? So another thing that our PMC did was we instituted a role. So every club, the 32 NFL clubs, has a pain management specialist that works with the team medical staff, and they work with the medical staff to look at the PDMP data. And so if there are prescription trends that may be different, right? If one club is using more of a particular pain management medication, an NSAID, let's say, like ketorolac, then we're going to look at that and we're going to offer feedback to that club and say, well, maybe this isn't the best idea. Maybe your numbers are a little bit different than some of the other clubs. And that's a way, similar to how things go in general medicine, right? Like I get information every year looking at my prescription trends, for example. So that's a way that we can try to keep these things in line and keep them aligned with the best and the brightest new evidence in that area.
So, we're not far from where the Miami Dolphins play. So let's use them as an example. What would pain management look like, for instance, for them, and how are they sort of trying to keep those opioids, the use of opioids down?
Yeah, well, I think that every player is interested in their best performance, and so they're working with their training staff, the boots on the ground every day, the medical staff associated with that team, and so if there is an injury that occurs, then they're going to work with that staff to figure out the best treatment plan for that particular injury. And so again, as we see, when we talk about chronic pain, like acute pain, there probably are some instances where it may make sense to use an opioid, but there really is very little evidence supporting the use of opioids for the treatment of chronic pain. And so therefore, if a player from the Dolphins gets an injury, they're going to work with their medical staff, figure out the best treatment plan. And as we've seen with the data, that's probably not going to include opioids.
What sort of treatments might they be?
Well, I think that, again, when you look at it, so there are a lot of non-pharmacological treatments that these folks may be used, with physical therapists, for example, but most of the prescriptions that we've seen are probably for things that we may use. People are more familiar with things like naproxen or ibuprofen. So I think those are more commonly first-line treatments for some of these injuries, at least when they become a chronic injury.
I want to get your perspective on this from, being, head of the joint or part of the joint pain management committee. The Miami Dolphins coach recently spoke about Raheem Mostert suffering a hip injury, and he called him a warrior. So I'm curious, how do you work within that culture where you've got folks who are trying to work through the pain? They've got these short-term expectations, but also you've got to worry about their long-term health as well.
Yeah, well, so I think the NFL has folks at multiple levels trying to take care of these players, right? So the Dolphins or any club has a very extensive staff that's working with them 24/7 to try to improve their performance and think about their long-term health. And I think that's partially why the PMC was created, right? So we're at a different level, sort of removed from it, looking at the evidence, looking at year-to-year prescriptions, looking at patterns of prescriptions during a season and trying to make sure that those are aligned with the best evidence. So we want to make sure that players get the best treatments that they can get that, again, has an eye towards their long-term health.
What are some of the alternatives the league has been exploring for pain management?
Yeah, so I'm somebody that's done a lot of research in cannabis and cannabinoids, and I think that's partially why I've been involved with the league over the last few years, right? There's always been an interest for the last decade or so from players talking about cannabis and other cannabinoids like cannabidiol or CBD. I think that's one of the great things that the PMC has been able to institute. So we've listened to the players, the things that they're interested in, and we've spent a lot of time looking at things like CBD. We've talked with hundreds, literally, of groups that are doing that kind of work over the years. And the NFL and the NFLPA collaborated to fund a number of studies, right? I think that's one thing that's really important. A lot of people across the country and around the world talk about, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had some data on this, right? There are millions of people using cannabis and cannabinoids to treat a host of medical conditions, including pain, and the amount of evidence that we have really has not kept pace with that level of interest. And I think one of the things I'm proud of with our involvement with the NFL and the NFLPA and the PMC is that we're funding studies. So we've funded a number of studies in the United States and Canada, actually, that are looking at pain management of elite athletes. And we're studying cannabis and combination CBD, THC medications to look at that. So hopefully we'll have some evidence soon, right? Because again, as much as players are interested in elite performance, because they're elite athletes, they're warriors, as you said, we want to make sure that what they're doing is evidence-based. The treatments that they're receiving are evidence-based. And so that's really the point of this. And I'm fortunate to be in a position where we can fund some of those trials. So hopefully we'll have some exciting results out in the next year or so.
It's really interesting. In covering medical marijuana or cannabis, what I found most often is an average person will go into a place that's selling it, and I have found that they take it very seriously, but it is just some guy behind a counter who's saying, I think you should take this or that. Do you think we're moving to a place where we would have like dosages and prescriptions and
slowly,
okay.
I would say. So I totally understand what you're saying. There are people out there that are suffering. They have pain. They're looking for treatments, right? They're not satisfied, and they shouldn't be satisfied, right? If their pain is not well managed, they should be scouring for the best available treatments out there. And so that's why I think a lot of folks have turned towards cannabis, CBD, and other treatments too, but unfortunately, as you said, the level of evidence isn't great, plus the medical community isn't very comfortable in trying to manage those alternative treatments, unfortunately. So as you said, patient may go into a dispensary and they're sort of at the mercy of the bud tender, who again probably knows a lot about cannabis compared to the general population, but it's not really at the rigorous level that we would hope for when we talk about medicine. So we're always looking for the best available treatments, whether it be cannabinoids or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or other medications too.
And sticking with just the average person, not these elite athletes, you do work in a hospital, so you do work with average folks too. What do you find is the most frustrating part of pain for the patients that you work with?
Well, I think, we're talking about this backstage. There are a lot of patients who are working well with their physician. They're doing everything right. And so those are the folks that I will see. I'll have either a general physician or a pain physician send somebody to me because of my background with cannabinoids. And what I find a lot of times is that, you will have a collaborative group, right? A patient, often their spouse, and the doctor working together to try to treat a chronic condition. And they may try multiple medications, they may try injections, and then they come to me and they haven't had the success that they're looking for. And that's where I think it's really important for a physician like myself to be willing to have the conversation, to look at treatments that may be third line, all right? Because they've tried first line treatments, they've tried second line treatments with often limited success. And sometimes those third line treatments, if you add them to these other treatments, you can have success. And we've been fortunate to do that. So I think it's frustrating. I can appreciate the frustration that patients have when they're living with it every day. They're the ones that have to deal with it. It's 9 o'clock at night. They're the ones dealing with their back pain. And so sometimes I think physicians are reticent to think outside the box. And so we want to try to encourage that. And that's why we, as a PMC, we're publishing our findings to try to educate people so that doctors feel more comfortable trying treatments that they may not otherwise be comfortable prescribing.
What's the most exciting thing you're watching in pain management right now that's coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think there are a lot of companies that are working on new medications, and I think that's exciting. What we have, there's a certain level of efficacy available with the medications that we have. And so for some, again, every person's injury can be different. And so for some people, fortunately, the tools that we have are sufficient and they do have adequate pain management. But for a lot of people, we don't. So I think that we need to be aggressively pursuing new treatments of all different modalities, medications and otherwise, right? Non-pharmacological treatments too. And so I think I'm excited about what the PMC is doing, right? Funding research, looking at cannabis, cannabinoids, other pain medications for sure. But we need to be thinking outside the box and looking for new medications too. And so I think that's one great thing about this field is I think that because of the fact that there are a lot of folks suffering from pain and they're advocating for themselves, I think that there's a lot of movement taking place. And so, there are new medications that are in the pipeline that'll be coming out. And I'm optimistic that we'll have better treatments available pretty soon.
What do you think are the best lessons that the average, the average Joe, the average athlete can learn from these elite athletes you're working with in the NFL?
Well, I think that you have to be educated about the treatments that you're applying, right? I think that, again, there's a lot of pressure. People who are doing things at the professional level and the amateur level, they're thinking about their best performance, right? If you're spending hours a week doing a particular activity, you want to perform at your best, whether it's a triathlon or a 5K race, let's say. So there are a lot of fads that come out and people are talking about, oh, this is a great way to cut weight or run faster or whatever the case may be. And I think that what I would say is you need to learn the idea that you need to be educated about what you're doing. You really need to be thinking about where you're getting your information from. Is this an evidence-based treatment? And I would always advocate for being able to talk with your doctor about these things, because again, as much as we're interested in the performance aspects of these things, we also want to make sure that these treatments are safe. Right? I do see sometimes that people will try treatments that may not be FDA approved, for example, and there are a lot of purity, potency, safety issues with those things that, sometimes if the physician's not involved, then those things can become a problem. Again, we talk about cannabinoids, for example, and I have encouraged patients for years to work with your doctor. And again, the flip side of that is we need to educate those doctors so they know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But if we have educated patients and educated clinicians working together, then I think we can effectively reduce some of the risks and hopefully improve the treatments that are being implemented.
Well, that's we're coming up on time here, but we want to end on one fun thing right now. If you had to guess, what two teams would you expect to see at the Super Bowl in February?
I'd say Philadelphia and Kansas City.
Okay, he's on the record. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. That is all the time we have.
Right.
We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. All right. Great.
We're out here. Stay tuned for more great conversations.
Introducing our View from the Top moderator and Axios publisher, Nicholas Johnston.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Nick Johnston, the publisher of Axios. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's very excited to be out on the road in Miami for us at Axios. Very grateful for all of you here in person, all of you live online. We couldn't do anything without the support of our readers and listeners and watchers like this. We're also hugely grateful to all of our partners. Like nothing we do at Axios is possible without the support of our partners. So huge thanks to Vertex Pharmaceuticals for making today's conversation possible. And I'm very excited to welcome to the stage from Vertex the Senior Vice President of Disease Area and Disease Area Executive of Pain, Paul Negulescu. Paul, welcome to the Axios stage. Good morning. Morning. Let's start big picture. Why are you here? Why is this conversation important to Vertex?
Well, we're here because there's a great unmet need to treat pain. I think we heard from Dr. Hill some of the examples of that, and we're here to help try to raise awareness of that unmet need. In particular, we're going to talk a little this morning, I think, about the unmet need in acute pain. We hear a lot about chronic pain, but there's also a really big need in acute pain. In fact, there are 80 million Americans that get a prescription for acute pain every year. And of those, about half, or 40 million, have to take an opioid to alleviate their pain. So there's a lot of need for other options for these patients to manage both their acute and chronic pain.
I mean, and what always astounds me in conversations about pain management, just like the magnitude we were talking about stages, like there's tens and tens of millions of people, and almost everyone sort of has a story, either themselves personally or someone else. You've been digging into this. I know that you've done some survey and research. Can you share a little bit about what you've learned as part of that research?
That's right. I mean, as big as those numbers are, what we found out is that there's really not a lot of information about how prescribers and patients feel about their pain management, those tens and tens of millions. So we went and did a survey, the results of which are actually available today, to begin to ask some deeper questions about how patients felt about their treatments and how the physicians felt about their options as well.
And then what was your reaction to the results?
Well, there were some surprising things that came out of it. I mean, the first, at least for me, was that while we think about acute pain as something that just lasts a couple of days and resolves pretty quickly, you know, the actual definition of acute pain is pain that lasts up to 90 days, and then after 90, it's considered chronic. And what these patients that had experienced acute pain in the last year, 1,000 of them were in the survey,
Right.
told us was that on average they lost 19 days of work. So this was not something that was affecting them for 1 or 2 days. This was something that affected them
I mean,
significantly.
and that's worth, I even think, like putting a emphasis on. Like that's almost 4 weeks.
That's a lot of time.
Work, and that's that's the midpoint.
That's
of
right.
that.
So that surprised us. It was that much, and the physicians, 500 of which were also in the survey, also indicated that they had seen that they had seen the significant disruption just from that acute pain incident in many of their patients. So we're going to be doing more research to understand more about those patients, but the initial information is really striking.
I mean, like the scale of the challenge, I think, is very apparent just in the conversations and that kind of research. Well, then the flip side of that is, like, so then what are the challenges in addressing that? Now that we know the size and scope of this problem, what's next?
Well, one of the reasons we're in this situation is that we don't have a lot of options to treat the pain. So if people are missing that much work, having that much disruption from their pain, it's because whatever the management isn't working for them. So what we're faced with today is actually the same set of medications that we've had for the last 50 years. Ibuprofen, acetaminophen, so Advil, Tylenol. For the more mild to moderate pain, those work reasonably well. But then when the pain is more severe, there's only one option right now, and those are the opioids. And so we need something in the middle. That's the gap that is driving this unmet need.
Where does an element of education fit into this as far as, like, I think there's something that came up backstage, what Dr. Hill talked about. Where do you look at, like, educating both patients, caregivers, the medical establishment around different kinds of options and the need?
I think that's a really good question, and education and advocacy kind of go together.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Hill mentioned it as well. So it starts with being informed as a patient, asking your doctor about what your options are. If you would rather not take an opioid, let your doctor know that, because they will try to assist you with that.
Right.
And then, the advocacy, taking some ownership of that discussion as a patient. And it's understandable, many patients who go to physicians have other issues that they're dealing with than pain. But sometimes there isn't enough focus on the pain management part of their treatment.
Right.
And they don't have those discussions, or they don't know what questions to ask.
But also educating the doctors to answer the question instead of just giving.
Indeed.
That's typical. From a much more broader standpoint, like, why do you think it's so important to focus on pain management now? Like, why is this a moment to really begin to narrow in on it?
Well, it's probably a prolonged moment. It's
Right.
something that we've been talking about as a society for a while. In fact, the CDC, declared a healthcare emergency based on the opioid epidemic about a decade ago. So
Right.
we're a decade into that.
So this isn't new.
This isn't new.
Right.
But I think there's momentum building. There's excitement building about the potential for new options coming forward. There's interest in physicians and patients, working more together. So I think the rising tide is lifting all the boats here.
Right.
And we're working together to solve this problem.
It's a long journey that's kind of maybe hitting an inflection point as far as looking for alternatives.
And we've got to keep after it.
I want to spin this forward in a second, but I'd like to make a little bit of a detour to narrow in. We're here in Miami, Florida. Was there any particular Florida-focused data that came out of the research?
Well, thank you for mentioning Miami. It's a great town. I hadn't been here till this trip.
Great weather here for those of us down from the East Coast.
And it's a wonderful place. And actually, Florida overall provided a lot of input into this national survey. So Floridians were very interested in participating. They were very active in giving their feedback. Some of the interesting points from Florida perspective, well, there were two. One, the patients said that they didn't really know how to have the conversation with their doctor.
Right.
They didn't know what questions to ask. They didn't feel comfortable about having that conversation. So again, that speaks to the need for education and advocacy and just making people feel like it's okay to talk about pain.
Right.
The other thing that they mentioned is that over a third of them had a close family member or close friend who had an opioid addiction. and that was higher than the national average by quite a bit.
Yeah.
So this is something that is touching people in multiple ways.
Very prevalent here in this community. Well, let's spin this forward here. Like, I love these kinds of events because of like the engaged audience we get of these people who care about this topic, both here and watching online. What's the homework for them? What's the call for action? How can they help?
Well, the folks that are here have already started their homework because they're interested in the topic.
Yeah.
I would say help us move the topic forward. Help have this national conversation, and we're going to 4 cities with this program. And speaking to various experts and hearing different perspectives, just continue to be part of that conversation. We have information available around the room on the iPads. You can go to vrtx.com and find the information from the surveys. Use that information if it's helpful for you to advocate on behalf of yourself, your family members, and others with pain.
And that kind of brings it back to full circle, like equipping both patients to be able to talk about this with their doctors and doctors to be able to answer those questions about the broad.
That's right. And Dr. Hill, made a great point about we all have to educate ourselves. It's not just on the physicians or the patients, it's all of us. And it's not that complicated, actually.
Right.
With only 3 options for medication, most of us can remember 3. If there are 4 or 5 down the road, maybe we can remember 4 or 5. But it's accessible.
And being a participant in those kinds of conversations and spreading the good word.
Yes.
Paul, excellent conversation. Thanks for being here. Huge thanks to Vertex for making today possible. Stick around. The conversation continues.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Axios senior policy reporter, Caitlin Owens.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and online. I'm honored to be joined here by our next guest, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the U.S. Pain Foundation. She's a leading advocate for the needs of people living with pain. Please welcome Cindy Steinberg. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think the best place to begin here is just with your own pain journey. And so can you just tell us a little bit about that journey and then how it's tied to your advocacy work today?
Sure. So I was a corporate manager and I was on the phone to a client. I went out to retrieve a file, and unbeknownst to me, moving men had stacked cubicle walls behind my file cabinet. And I opened the drawer and the whole cabinet came at me, and I turned to get away, but I wasn't quick enough. And the drawer knocked me over, struck me in the middle of my back, and then I was crushed underneath the walls and the cabinet. And that left me with really terrible back pain across my thoracic back.
And so, just from our conversation a little bit, that began a long journey, but just as a patient, right? And, before you became an advocate, what was your experience like as a patient?
So that was 5 years of looking for help. While I tried to maintain my job, I had a baby and I was married, I traveled frequently and had a really busy life, but I had this horrible pain as soon as I got up across the middle of my back. And then the longer I was up, then I started feeling these muscle spasms that would just get tighter and tighter. And they couldn't operate. And so I went to doctor after doctor, and most of them said, you could try this one thing, and if it doesn't help you, I'm not sure what to do. And I tried nerve blocks and went to a number of pain clinics and injections, and then lots of other things as well. Sometimes people treated me like I was making this up. It was shocking to me because I was somebody that worked in startup companies, lots of hours, and so it was a really eye-opening journey for the struggles people go through with pain.
And what did you learn about how common that is?
Yeah, so I put up a sign at a local library when I had this pain, thinking I can't be the only one living like this, that I was starting a group. And people just started showing up. This was just in a local library. And the first month, somebody came with thoracic outlet syndrome from using computers, and a woman with spinal stenosis, and then they came back, and a guy came with migraine headaches every day as a result of chemotherapy. And he came back, and there were people with various kinds of musculoskeletal pain, surgeries that had developed into chronic pain, daily migraines, things I hadn't heard of, like Behçet syndrome or vulvodynia, endometriosis. And all these people kept coming living with pain. And I thought, wow, this is really eye-opening. I can't believe how many people are living like this. And then I started to do some research and found out that 50 million Americans live with chronic pain, 20% of the country of adults live with chronic pain, and 7% live with high-impact chronic pain, and it's the #1 cause of disability.
20%, wow. So just as a little kind of experiment here on the fly, can you raise your hand if you know someone or are someone who's living with chronic pain? Oh, wow, that's more than 20%. Wow.
That was a really good question, and I've done that before. And pain is something people often don't talk about. In fact, backstage we were just talking about pain, and somebody who lives with pain all the time, her coworkers didn't even know it. And so oftentimes it's an invisible disease, and people don't know that other people are really struggling with it. People are, afraid to be forward about it. They don't want to talk about it. There's stigma around living with pain. And then there are people that are so debilitated that they're isolated, that they don't go out because they never know how bad the pain is going to be and whether it's going to make them leave or be unreliable. And so between people like isolating themselves and others not talking about it, people don't know that this many people are suffering with pain.
Well, in just a moment of self-awareness here, as a pain advocate, I guess you probably, the first thing people talk to you about is their pain or who they know or what they experience. So I'm sure you're much more aware than the average person. So just kind of switching gears a little bit here. So now to your advocate side, it's definitely been an interesting decade or so in the conversation about pain. So how would you say what you've advocated for has changed over kind of, again, the last decade or so, especially in the context of the opioid epidemic?
Yeah, so one of the things that's happened is sadly, there's just not many options. And so when people are living with pretty severe pain, there's almost no other options beside opioids. There are some drugs used off-label, but they're not that effective. And so what we've seen is the pullback in opioids, meaning that so many people that were using them successfully as legitimate patients long-term have been unable to get them. And so that's created a huge unmet need because there's been so few other therapeutics. In addition to that, it made Congress ask, well, why don't you just use something else? And basically advocates said, there's hardly any other options, and we've done so little research in understanding the basic mechanism of pain that we don't have other information on how to understand it. In fact, we still don't understand the basic neurobiological mechanism of pain in the human body. And so we saw that there was a great need for research, and so we finally got more money directed at NIH for research. The other thing that Congress said was, well, what is the best way to manage pain now? And they appointed a panel in 2018 and 19 to come up with what is the best way to manage pain given that we don't have other really great options. And the answer was a multidisciplinary approach. And I had found that too with my pain. So for example, I do an exercise program, I take a medication that's used off-label, and I lie down every hour for 25 minutes to manage my pain. And that's what we tell people. Really, you need to take a multidisciplinary approach, that it's very individualized. What helps one person doesn't necessarily help another. And that combining those things will give you, a percentage reduction in pain such that you can have a life, you can work, et cetera.
And so I want to rewind a little bit. You just talked about more funding for the NIH for pain research. I want to connect that to something the last speaker was talking about a little bit about how just kind of this moment that we're in. How has more money for this pain research translated into kind of where we are today?
So great question. And in fact, there has been, since 2018 is when we first got more than double the budget in NIH for pain research. It was less than 2% for the #1 reason why Americans go to the doctor, and now it's over 4%. So that's been a big increase. And what that has meant is it allowed us to look for new targets the NIH has said that they've discovered something like 40 new targets of different molecules to look at that might affect the ability to reduce people's pain. And so we're really hopeful that some of these have led to new companies looking at developing new therapeutics, and we are very hopeful that there's a couple of new things in the pipeline that are coming along, and that hopefully there will be new options for people living with pain.
Yeah, can you talk about what it is that makes some of these new options promising?
Yeah, so one of the things, reason we're here is because Vertex is working on some new promising molecules for pain. The first one they're looking at is for an acute indication, which is great, but we're really hoping that more companies will look at chronic pain, because that's really the big deal. And now that we understand things like central sensitization, that is, with chronic pain, it really is its own disease. And so we now know it is a disease of the nervous system and the brain. And so regardless of what originally caused it, if it's diabetes, if it's cancer, et cetera, they have a comorbid condition. And now that we understand it is definitely a disease of the nervous system and brain, there's been a lot more research on nerves, how nerves process pain, why some pain doesn't turn off and continues to fire, and trying to quiet the nervous system by using new techniques.
That's really interesting. So Vertex is obviously kind of imminently in the pipeline. Are there how many would you say other kind of targets are?
There are, the NIH has said that they've discovered 40 new targets, but I just went to a pain therapeutics conference, and there were lots of small companies now that are developing options for pain. I mean, Bio had a report last year in 23, and it said that for the past decade, there hasn't been a novel pain therapeutic, and that the chances of success from phase 1 to actual FDA approval were 0.7% for pain and 6.5% for every other disease area.
Wow.
So it's been so far behind and so neglected that almost any new therapeutics are exciting, and we're looking for them to come down the pipeline. But I really do think there will be new therapeutics in the next year or so that'll be helpful for people.
So looking generally to 2025, I think you have a yearly advocacy agenda. What do you think that'll look like next year, even if you don't have any kind of formal proposals yet?
So I do think that hopefully doctors are getting better educated about the best ways to manage pain. That's one of the challenges. The doctors get so little education in pain. So we're hoping to improve that. We have a couple of bills before Congress now that will hopefully help people with coverage, because getting coverage for alternative treatments is really difficult. And so I work both at the state and the federal level to try to improve payer coverage of treatments for pain. And let's hope that some of these new therapeutics really do work for a good percentage of people living with both acute and chronic pain, so that they can go on and have a life, can work part-time, et cetera. So I'm really optimistic that that'll happen.
Yeah, so those coverage barriers, what are some of the treatment options that don't tend to get coverage?
Yeah, so typically things like complementary treatments are not usually covered. So things like acupuncture, which helps some number of people, massage, longer physical therapy. So if you think about it, pain is a chronic condition, and just having 10 visits to a physical therapist and something that you're living with for 20 years is not really going to help you. You really need ongoing treatment, and so being able to get improved longer treatments for people living with pain is also really important.
So with the last few minutes we have, I want you to kind of look back. How long have you been a pain advocate?
Been an advocate for more than 20 years.
More than 20 years. So your multi-decade career. How would you say societal awareness or responsiveness to pain has changed?
So, sadly, I don't think it has changed that much. And I'm really hoping that that'll change now that we have some new therapeutics and companies interested that are promoting opportunities like this to really talk about it. It's still the case that when people come to my pain group, they've had to see 4 or 5 multiple practitioners until they can find any help. And we're seeing that still 50 million Americans are living with pain, 17 million are living with high impact chronic pain that affects their ability to function on a daily basis. So sadly, not that much has changed, and I'm really hoping that in the future there's going to be new opportunities for people with pain to be able to have some pain relief.
Well, Cindy, thank you so much for spending time with us today and for your input. Very interesting conversation. For the rest of you, please stay tuned for one final conversation today.
Thanks.
Welcoming back to the stage, Axios senior healthcare reporter Tina Reed.
Thank you so much. So excited to be back and chatting with a very interesting doctor today, Dr. Christian Gonzalez, CEO of the Spine and Wellness Centers of America. And thank you so much for making time for this conversation today. We've heard a lot of really interesting things today about why pain is such a problem. It's been said in America, we are in the midst of a pain epidemic, more than 50 million suffering from chronic pain. So I'd love to hear from your perspective as a provider, why is pain such a big problem? Why do we see this?
I mean, pain debilitates, incapacitates the human being, and it leads to suffering. We were talking a little bit about the mental health aspect of it. So when you're suffering from pain for, as we talk about, more than 90 days, 6 months, depends on what definition you're utilizing, this creates a change in your brain mechanism, the way it functions, because now suffering incorporates into it, and it's very debilitating. So these persons are not able to incorporate back into their daily activities and things that make them happy because they're limited due to pain. So it's of utmost importance. We need to treat it, and we need to take care of pain as soon as we can to prevent that chronic phase from occurring.
And why is it so common?
I mean, there's more and more activities that we are doing, and now we have a lot of motor vehicle accidents. We have a lot of, we're aging more, and the aging population is prone more to falls, and our bones are not as strong. And there's just, I think this, the age of the humans just lasting longer now. Longevity is causing pain to be something that is so much common and debilitating, particularly for that age group.
What do you wish more doctors knew about pain management?
A lot. Yeah, it's frustrating. There seems sometimes, we're the largest in the state, Florida, from a pain management standpoint for acute pain in the hospitals and rehabilitation centers. And some of the surgeons and some of the doctors, they don't understand why the importance of having us in the patient care. So when you look at the United States as a whole, and then the whole globe of planet Earth and the countries, acute pain management is very, very underutilized. And so people that continue to have acute pain are the ones that develop chronic pain. So one of the things that I would love for other doctors to understand is, like, if you can nip that acute pain right when it's occurring and don't let it lead to chronic pain, it doesn't lead to suffering and then other things with the mental health, so that it decouples that from the patient and it leads to a faster recovery. So I think that would be the one thing that I would love to teach more medical students, in making sure you utilize your pain providers as soon as possible to help eliminate the possibility of causing chronic pain.
I loved when we were talking backstage. When you were president of the American Academy of Pain Management, you actually ran into some controversy over your support for medical marijuana. Can you describe what happened?
Well, yes, it was very interesting. So that's when I learned the power of lobbying. But Yeah, as a president, you're trained to be able to be a speaker with the media, but the media, as Tina knows, and she's very good at it, has also been trained to be able to get to the answers. So I was told not to speak much about medical marijuana for chronic pain patients as an alternative, but one of the reporters did get to me by asking me, would I allow my parents to utilize it if the time or the need came about, and I did say yes, and then he was like, well, wait, why? And I'm like, well, because, for some people it might be an option. And then once that occurred, then I was told no longer to be the president because because I had gone against what I was told not to speak about it due to sponsorship, right? Let's just say that the pharmaceuticals sponsor some of the lectures and the activities for the society, and they did not want medical marijuana to be discussed.
So you got fired.
So I got fired. I lasted, I think, 2 weeks as the president.
Oh, man.
I served 4 years as a board member and vice president, but yeah, the presidency didn't last too long.
What do you think that says, though, when you think about over time how things have changed? Obviously, we've heard a lot today about, for instance, that being a potential option for pain management. What does that tell us about what we need to be considering when we think about the whole spectrum of options for pain?
Great question, and exactly, like, you have to be able to think outside the box. What we currently have is not working. Dr. Hill even said it. The NFL was completely against medical marijuana, and they were actually suspending players that tested positive, and now they're actually legalized it on the NFL as a company, and now they're actually studying that this could actually be beneficial to the athletes. So we have to take our blindfolds, we have to take our thoughts of drugs that in the past we have decided that they're class 1, non-medical value for whatever reason was done, and we have to open up the channels to be able to investigate and research more of these potential drugs that will alleviate pain, and in the chronic phase also alleviate suffering, because some of them may not work for pain as good, but they might actually work for suffering and create happiness into our patients with chronic pain.
And so, for instance, you actually use ketamine in your clinic, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you talk about just how you've seen that impact your patients?
Yeah, so ketamine is very, very interesting. It's a dissociative state medication. It's a very powerful analgesic. In fact, you can actually perform surgery on a patient under a intravenous infusion of ketamine while they're wide awake and breathing on their own. And also, it has a hallucinating therapeutic effect to dissociate what is the reality that you're having and your perception. So when a person with chronic pain is suffering, the suffering doesn't allow it to see that they may have a beautiful life, a beautiful family, other things that would create joy and happiness in the regular human being. But in these people, their suffering is so impregnated with pain that ketamine actually allows us to separate, to decouple it, if you will. And then through therapists that are there administering the ketamine treatment sessions, we're able to then explain to them, okay, this is part of your life. You do have this pain and you have this condition, but your other life is also important, and let's concentrate on that and appreciate and be grateful for the other aspect of your life that you can enjoy. And so ketamine is a great example of something that now is allowed for us to utilize in our patients and help decouple that suffering, which again in the chronic pain patient becomes very important.
And just to put a finer point on that, you keep talking a little bit about this psychological connection with pain. So that's one of the examples of how you can address, I guess, like the mental health aspect of pain as well. Is that right?
Correct. So when we first started studying pain a long time ago, we did not incorporate any pain psychology into the pain definition. But now, by definition of chronic pain, you have to incorporate the psychological experience of the individual. So it is definitely tied with pain. So you cannot decouple them and say that pain is not associated with physiological disturbance, because it is a personal experience. And my best example of it, while I was at MD Anderson Cancer Center, we used to utilize epidural catheters for thoracic surgery. So think about lung cancers, and we're removing your lung, and we have to dice you back then, complete chest open, huge incision, take the lung out, and then we put a catheter for the patient to relieve pain. So one of the things that I started seeing was that patients from India, particularly if they were poor when they were growing up, they after 2 days they were like, take the catheter away, I'm ready to go home, and we would be like, wait, what? No way. And the Americans would be like 5 days, and the Latinos, we would need a whole week of the catheter, right? So it shows you that each cultural and background of your experience matters. And eventually I did study it, and it came out to be that when you're poor in India, you don't have access to ibuprofen or acetaminophen, right? Particularly, I'm talking about 30 years ago. I'm a little older than you might think. So these gentlemen, they did not get exposed to any of these medications, so they were able to tolerate pain more. While in America and in Latin America, when the baby starts crying, for fever or something, we stick that Tylenol immediately, right? So it does matter what your exposure and your background and cultural beliefs are.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about what are some of the more exciting pain management tools on the horizon, in particular neurostimulation of the spinal cord, peripheral nerve stimulators. Can you talk a little bit about what's coming?
Yes, so because of this realization that opioids are not the answer, particularly for chronic pain. For chronic pain, opioids are not the answer, right? Acute pain, they're still a very good option, but for a chronic pain, they're not. So it has turned that needle for the past 20 years into discovering other modalities that help with the chronic pain patients. So neuromodulation is a way that we can actually insert electrical wires into your spinal cord, and then we can neuromodulate the information that gets to your brain. So let's say you're suffering from chronic leg pain. Now we're able to cause the leg pain when the transmission from pain that is going to go through your brain, we're able to block it at the spinal cord level and have you feel some pleasant sensation in your leg, so you don't have to have that incapacitation. On the peripheral nerve stimulation, same thing. So we have patients that have surgeries like total knee replacement surgery, total shoulder, and others, total ankles, whatever you want to call it, and they're still suffering with pain. So now we can put a neuromodulator peripherally and stimulate that nerve. So again, when that nerve is firing to the brain that I'm in pain or there's an inflammation going on here, we can block it, and the patient doesn't perceive that. So it's very, very exciting. The therapy has been around since the 1980s, but it's just become better and better. Every year technology improves and the outcomes get better, so we're very excited about that.
What about the use of VR or virtual reality for pain? How does that work?
Yes, so there's a lot of evidence already demonstrating that when the acute rehabilitation component of pain, so right after surgery, when you got to go do your exercises to recover, that's very painful. And when you put your virtual reality headset, you're able to go to a place where mentally you couldn't go without it. So that is very important, and it's actually been proven that it's effective. I think with time, technology is going to get better, and we're going to be able to incorporate better headsets, which I think is the major drawback right now. And I think that once that technology solves that issue, I think for chronic pain purposes, it's going to be very powerful. I am very excited about virtual reality, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, basically.
I've heard that's especially effective in kids and helping them when an injury is healed, but they're still experiencing that perception of pain.
Correct.
Yeah.
It is very powerful. The children have a lot of neuroplasticity. So one of the worst syndromes you can have as an adult is something called complex regional pain syndrome. And as a child, it almost is non-existent. And it's funny because as a child, they may have that pain and that injury, but you tell them, look, you're fine, go run. And because they want to play, they just go run and play. And that's what the body needs to rehabilitate. Versus the adult thinks like, well, if I utilize my knee and I'm hurting, even though they say it's fine, I don't want to run, I don't want to utilize it because I'm going to hurt it more.
Yeah.
So that mentality and that decoupling with virtual reality becomes more acceptable to the brain of the adult.
That's neat. Well, I want to end on, what's next? What should we be watching for? And you were mentioning about digital AI twins and how perhaps we might be able to predict injuries before they ever happen. Can you talk about that?
Correct. So as you have seen with this recent signing of Juan Soto for $700 million, Patrick Mahomes from the NFL, $500 million, these athletes are worth a lot of money and investment from the teams. And so there's been now technology being developed, particularly in the European soccer leagues, that we actually have it on your cell phone. We ask you to perform certain exercises on a daily basis for these professional athletes, and we're able to predict within 6 weeks of an injury. So we then communicate with the professional team and say, hey, listen, this athlete, his ankle, right ankle is not acting appropriate to his measurements. There's a high risk of an injury. Consider resting him for a couple of games to let him rehabilitate it. So we're actually very excited about this technology. It already exists. It's going to be a while before it gets to the public, but I would think in the next 5 years, we're going to have a lot of digital twins out there to help predict injuries for yourself as a regular human.
That is cool stuff. Well, thank you so much for making the time today. I really appreciate it. To our audience, thank you so much for your interest in these important and impactful conversations in this morning's program. We hope you enjoyed it, and please don't forget to sign up for my newsletter at axios.com. And we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.